November 1944, Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathes in the darkness. Steam rises from mud-caked foxholes along a nameless ridge, where men wait with rifles slick from rain and sweat. They are soldiers of the 93rd Infantry Division, Black Americans who crossed an ocean to fight an empire, only to find themselves still fighting for respect from their own army. Below them, through the tangled vines and shattered palms, Japanese forces are gathering. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. The men check their ammunition again. 30 rounds, 28, 19. They've been told the resupply won't come until morning. They've been told a lot of things that turned out to be lies. A young private from Alabama presses his back against the wet earth of his foxhole. In his pocket, there's a letter from home. Words from his mother about a lynching 2 towns over. A reminder that the enemy isn't just in front of him. But tonight, on this ridge, none of that matters. Tonight, they will hold. When America entered World War II in December 1941, it did so with an army divided by the color line. Black men could serve, yes, but only in segregated units, under white officers, and mostly in roles the military considered suitable for their race. Quartermaster battalions, engineering units, port companies that unloaded ships and built roads, while white soldiers received the glory of combat. The reasoning was cold and systemic. Military leadership, steeped in the prejudices of Jim Crow America, believed black men lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage for frontline warfare. Never mind that black soldiers had fought in every American war since the Revolution. Never mind the valor shown by the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. The institutional racism was deliberate, documented, and defended by men who wore stars on their shoulders. Training camps in the South became theaters of humiliation. Black soldiers stationed in Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia faced violence from local populations and indifference from military police. They trained with outdated weapons, received substandard equipment, and were denied access to facilities that German prisoners of war could use freely. The irony was bitter and inescapable. Enemy soldiers captured on the battlefield ate in restaurants that turned away American men in uniform because of their skin. Yet they kept enlisting. By 1945, more than 1 million black Americans would serve in uniform. They did so knowing the fight would be double-edged. The black press coined a phrase that became a rallying cry: the Double V campaign. Victory against fascism abroad. Victory against racism at home. It was printed on posters, shouted at rallies, whispered in training barracks from Fort Huachuca to Camp Claiborne. These soldiers understood they were fighting 2 wars simultaneously. One against the Axis powers, another against the chains of second-class citizenship. As the Pacific War intensified through 1942 and 1943, the demand for manpower grew desperate. Islands had to be taken, held, and defended. The Marine Corps and Army needed bodies. Lots of them. Reluctantly, grudgingly, black combat units began receiving deployment orders to the Pacific Theater. The 93rd Infantry Division, formed in 1942, became one of the first black divisions sent to face the Japanese. Most of its soldiers came from the South and Midwest. Men who had picked cotton, worked steel mills, shined shoes, and dreamed of something more. They trained hard, despite the obstacles. They knew the eyes of a skeptical nation were watching, waiting for them to fail, ready to use any mistake as proof of inferiority. By late 1944, elements of the 93rd found themselves scattered across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, tasked with mopping up operations and defensive positions that white units considered secondary priorities. But war doesn't respect the color line. And soon, on a muddy ridge in the jungles of Bougainville, these secondary soldiers would face a test that would shatter every racist assumption about their ability to fight. The 93rd Infantry Division arrived in the Pacific Theater, in stages throughout 1944. Unlike The celebrated white divisions that landed with fanfare and newsreel cameras. The black soldiers of the 93rd disembarked quietly at ports in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. They came expecting combat. Instead, they found themselves assigned to garrison duty, perimeter defense, and patrol operations that High Command deemed appropriate for Negro troops. But Bougainville was different. The island had been invaded by Allied forces in November 1943, and while the major Japanese strongholds had been neutralized, thousands of enemy soldiers remained scattered throughout the dense interior. They were cut off, starving, and desperate, but still dangerous. The Japanese command on Bougainville, under General Hyakutake Harukichi, had no intention of surrendering. His forces, though weakened, still numbered in the thousands and maintained defensive positions in the island's mountainous jungle terrain. By November 1944, elements of the 93rd Infantry Division's 25th Regimental Combat Team found themselves assigned to a series of defensive ridgelines on the Torokina perimeter. These weren't prestigious positions. They were considered backwater assignments: hold the ground, watch for infiltrators, keep the supply routes secure. The kind of work that wouldn't make headlines. One particular ridge, unnamed on most military maps, ran east-west through secondary jungle about 8 miles from the main American base. It wasn't tall by mountain standards, but it offered commanding views of the approaches from Japanese-held territory. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy was probing the American perimeter, testing for weak points, possibly planning a larger assault to recapture lost ground, or at least inflict casualties that might restore morale to their starving troops. The soldiers assigned to hold this ridge numbered fewer than 200. Most were riflemen with a handful of machine gun crews and a single mortar team. Their commander, a white captain who had never led black troops before, made his doubts clear through silence and distance. He established his command post a half-mile behind the ridge and visited infrequently. The senior black non-commissioned officers, sergeants who had trained these men, who knew their capabilities and their hunger to prove themselves, took charge of the actual defensive preparations. They positioned machine guns at the most likely assault points. They established fields of fire. They dug foxholes deep and reinforced them with logs stripped from fallen trees. They rationed ammunition carefully, knowing that supply officers often forgot to prioritize black units. And they waited. Japanese patrols had been spotted moving through the jungle below. Radio intercepts suggested something larger was coming, not just harassment, but a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm an isolated position and demonstrate that the Emperor's soldiers still had teeth. The irony wasn't lost on the men digging in along that ridge. They had traveled 6,000 miles to fight for freedom and democracy, only to find themselves still segregated, still doubted, still treated as lesser. But they had rifles. They had each other, and they had something else: a burning need to prove that courage had no color. The Japanese were coming, and this small black unit, dismissed and underestimated, would soon teach an empire a lesson about underestimating men based on the color of their skin. Every man on that ridge carried 2 wars inside him. The first was obvious. The Japanese Empire, visible through the jungle canopy, armed and advancing. That enemy could be faced with bullets and grenades and the raw animal courage that surfaces when death comes close. The second war was harder to fight. It lived in memory and humiliation, in every reminder that the uniform they wore meant less because of the skin beneath it. These men had grown up under Jim Crow. They knew the taste of separate water fountains, the back doors of restaurants, the fury of being called boy by men half their age. They had watched neighbors lynched for crimes they didn't commit while sheriffs looked away. They had boarded trains to training camps where German POWs rode in passenger cars while black soldiers stood in baggage compartments. And yet, they volunteered. They raised their right hands and swore an oath to a nation that barely acknowledged their citizenship. Why? Because they believed in something larger than the present moment. Because their fathers and grandfathers had fought in previous wars, hoping each conflict would crack the wall of racism just a little wider. Because the WWII campaign wasn't just a slogan, it was a bet on the future. A wager that proving their valor might finally force America to see them as men. But the weight of that burden was crushing. They weren't just fighting for their lives on this ridge. They were fighting for every black soldier who would come after them. For every mother who feared her son would be wasted in a labor battalion. For every child who needed to believe courage mattered more than color. One mistake, one retreat, one moment of panic, and white commanders would use it as evidence that black men couldn't fight. The pressure was relentless and invisible, heavier than any pack they carried. The mathematics of their situation were brutal. Intelligence estimated Japanese forces in the sector at battalion strength, somewhere between 300 and 500 men. The Americans on the ridge numbered 173. The ridge itself was approximately 800 yards long, which meant each man was responsible for roughly 4 to 5 yards of front line. In standard defensive doctrine, that was barely adequate against a probe. Against a full assault, it was suicide. Their weapons told the story of how little faith the Army had in them. Most carried M1 Garand rifles, standard issue, but their machine gun allocation was half what a white unit would receive in the same position. They had 2 30 caliber Brownings instead of 4. Their mortar team had one 60mm tube and 17 rounds. No artillery support was pre-registered on their position. No radio contact with fire support bases. The captain commanding them had taken the best radio equipment to his rear command post. They had ammunition for perhaps one sustained engagement. After that, it would come down to bayonets and entrenching tools. Resupply was promised for dawn, but dawn was 8 hours away. 8 hours in which anything could happen. The ridge's terrain offered some advantages. Steep approaches from the north and east. A narrow saddle connecting to the west, where the command post sat. But those same features that made it defensible also made it isolated. If the Japanese cut off the western approach, the men on the ridge would be surrounded with no extraction possible through the dense jungle. And there was another calculation, one the black soldiers understood even if it wasn't spoken aloud in official channels. If things went badly, how fast would reinforcements come for them? How much would white commanders risk to save a black unit? These were the questions that haunted the night as they waited. These were the angles that made this more than just another battle in the Pacific. The Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle below the ridge had been fed their own propaganda for years. Tokyo Rose broadcasts and printed leaflets dropped over American positions specifically targeted black soldiers, reminding them that they fought for a nation that lynched them, that denied them basic rights, that would never see them as equals. Why die for white America? The leaflets asked in broken English. The Japanese command believed this message would work. They assumed black units would be poorly motivated, badly trained, quick to break under pressure. After all, if America itself didn't value these soldiers, why would they fight with determination? It was a miscalculation built on profound ignorance. The Japanese didn't understand the WWII mindset. They couldn't comprehend men who fought, not despite the injustice, but partly because of it. Men determined to prove their worth on terms that couldn't be denied. The Emperor's soldiers expected an easy target. They were about to encounter something else entirely. The equipment disparities went deeper than machine gun allocations. The 93rd Infantry Division had trained with weapons that were outdated even before they shipped overseas. Their initial training at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, had been plagued by shortages. White divisions received priority for everything: ammunition for live fire exercises, replacement parts, even boots that fit properly. Many of the soldiers on the ridge had fired fewer than 200 rounds during their entire stateside training. Compare that to Marine units in the Pacific, who fired thousands of rounds before deployment. The black soldiers compensated with discipline and repetition, dry-firing their weapons until the manual of arms became muscle memory. Their officers, mostly white lieutenants and captains fulfilling assignments they didn't want, provided minimal leadership during training. Many had never commanded black troops and held deep prejudices about their capabilities. This meant the real training fell to black NCOs, sergeants who had served in peacetime and understood that excellence was the only argument that might penetrate racist assumptions. These sergeants drilled their men harder than any white officer demanded. They knew there would be no margin for error, no forgiveness for mistakes that white units made routinely. On the ridge that November night, the absence of white command presence meant black leadership rose to fill the vacuum. Staff Sergeant Samuel Jefferson, a 32-year-old former Pullman porter from Chicago, moved between positions checking fields of fire and calming younger soldiers. He had seen combat in New Guinea 3 months earlier and knew what was coming. His quiet confidence steadied nerves. Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, who had worked in his father's garage in Detroit before the war, had positioned the machine guns himself after the white captain's cursory approval. Hayes understood interlocking fields of fire better than any manual could teach. He had studied Belleau Wood and the Meuse Argonne, had read about black soldiers in the Harlem Hellfighters who had been loaned to French command because America wouldn't let them fight. These men led not through orders barked from safety, but through presence. They shared the same foxholes. They faced the same odds. And when the Japanese came, they would be the ones making split-second decisions that would determine whether their men lived or died. The white captain, comfortable in his command post, had radioed earlier that evening. His message was brief: hold your position. Reinforcements at dawn. What he didn't say, what the black soldiers already knew, was that they were on their own until sunrise. 8 hours that would become the longest night of their lives. It begins at 02:47 hours, not with a banzai charge or screamed battle cries, but with silence that suddenly feels wrong. The jungle noises, the insects, the night birds, the rustle of wind through palm fronds, all stop at once. Every man on the ridge feels it, that animal awareness that precedes violence. Then the mortars start falling. The first rounds land short, exploding in the jungle 50 yards below the defensive line. Shrapnel tears through vegetation. The next salvo walks closer. The Japanese are ranging their fire, finding the distance. The third concentration hits the ridge itself. Private James Wilson from Mississippi throws himself flat as a mortar round detonates 15 feet from his foxhole. Dirt and hot metal scream overhead. His ears ring. He tastes blood and realizes he's bitten through his lip. Sergeant Jefferson is already moving, running in a crouch between positions, making sure men keep their heads down, checking for casualties. A young soldier from Alabama is crying, not from fear, but from shrapnel wounds in his shoulder and neck. Jefferson applies a pressure bandage, while mortars continue to fall around them. The barrage lasts 7 minutes. 7 minutes that feel like 7 hours. When it stops, the silence returns, but only for a heartbeat. Then they come. The Japanese infantry emerges from the jungle like ghosts, materializing from darkness. They move in squad rushes, fire and maneuver, professional and coordinated. These aren't starving stragglers. These are combat veterans from General Hyakutake's best remaining units, soldiers who fought at Guadalcanal and survived when thousands didn't. The first wave hits the northern slope, where the ridge drops steeply into a ravine. "Hold your fire," Sergeant Hayes screams. "Wait for my command." The Japanese advance closer. 40 yards, 30, 25, now! The ridge erupts. M1 Garands crack in 8 round clips, the distinctive ping of ejecting magazines mixing with the deeper chatter of Browning machine guns. Tracers arc into the darkness, illuminating faces twisted with effort and fear on both sides. The Japanese soldiers stumble, fall, keep coming. More emerge from the jungle to replace the fallen. Private Wilson fires until his rifle runs empty, slaps in a new clip, fires again. Next to him, a soldier from Louisiana takes a bullet through the throat and goes down, choking. Wilson keeps firing. There's no time for anything else. The Japanese reach the base of the ridge and begin climbing. Hand grenades sail up toward American positions. Private Wilson catches one mid-flight and hurls it back. It detonates in the air, and he feels the concussion slap his face. For 20 minutes, the battle is desperate and close. Then, impossibly, the first wave breaks. The Japanese pull back, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead scattered on the slope. Staff Sergeant Jefferson does a quick count. 11 Americans wounded, 3 dead, and they've burned through nearly 40% of their ammunition. He tries the radio to report the assault and request immediate. Resupply. Static. Nothing but static. The line to the command post has been cut, either by mortars or by Japanese infiltrators. They are alone on this ridge, isolated, and the night is far from over. In the darkness below, Japanese officers are regrouping, preparing for a second assault. This time, they won't underestimate the small black unit that just bloodied their noses. The second assault comes at 04:20 hours, the darkest part of night, when exhaustion weighs heaviest and hope feels furthest away. This time, the Japanese attack from 3 directions simultaneously. They've learned from the first wave. No frontal assault up the northern slope where machine guns turned them back. Instead, they infiltrate through the jungle on the flanks. Small teams moving with patience and discipline, getting close before the attack signal sounds. The signal is a flare, green phosphorus that turns night into sickly daylight, and then they charge. Sergeant Hayes sees them coming up the eastern approach and swings his machine gun to meet them. The Browning hammers out short bursts, 3, 4, 5 rounds at a time, conserving ammunition that won't last much longer. Japanese soldiers fall, but more keep coming. They're firing as they advance. Type 38. Rifles cracking. Type 96 light machine guns adding their own stuttering rhythm. On the western end of the ridge, near the cut-off approach to the command post, Private Thomas Reed from Georgia finds himself facing 3 Japanese soldiers who've breached the perimeter. His rifle is empty. He pulls his bayonet and meets them in the darkness. What happens next is savage and brief. Steel on steel. Grunting, straining bodies. Reed takes a blade across his ribs but drives his own bayonet home. 1 enemy down. He wheels, blocks another thrust, and smashes his rifle butt into a face. The 3rd soldier shoots him in the leg, and Reed goes down but takes his attacker with him, fingers around the man's throat until the struggling stops. All along the ridge, similar struggles unfold. This isn't the clean warfare of tactics and strategy. This is intimate violence, men killing and dying within arm's reach of each other. Sergeant Jefferson finds himself in a foxhole with 2 young privates, all 3 fighting off 5 Japanese soldiers who've made it into their position. They fight with rifle butts, entrenching tools, fists, and rocks. 1 private dies with an enemy's hands around his throat, even as Jefferson buries a knife in the attacker's back. The ammunition is nearly gone. Machine guns fire their last belts. Rifles click empty and become clubs, but the ridge holds. At 05:45 hours, with first light just beginning to gray the eastern sky, the Japanese pull back a second time. Their casualties are staggering. More than 80 dead on the slopes, perhaps another 50 wounded being dragged back through the jungle. Behind their lines, a Japanese company commander stares through binoculars at the ridge that should have fallen hours ago. His orders were clear: overwhelm the position, break through to threaten American supply lines, prove that Japanese fighting spirit could still achieve victory. Instead, He faces a truth he can barely process. A small unit, depleted, undersupplied, isolated, has held against forces 3 times their number. The Americans on that ridge fought with a ferocity and discipline that shattered every assumption. What he doesn't know, what his intelligence never told him, is that these Americans had something his propaganda couldn't account for. They were fighting to prove their humanity to a world that questioned it. They were fighting for every black soldier who would come after. They were fighting because retreat meant confirming every racist lie ever told about them. At 0612 hours, as dawn breaks fully over Bougainville, the men on the ridge hear engines. American trucks and half-tracks are coming up the western approach, carrying reinforcements, ammunition, and medical supplies. The relief force, delayed, confused about the cut communications, finally recognizing the severity of the situation, has arrived. Staff Sergeant Jefferson stands on shaking legs, blood from a dozen minor wounds mixing with mud and gunpowder residue on his uniform. Around him, the survivors sit or lie in their foxholes, too exhausted to cheer. They held. Against every odd, against every doubt, they held, and somewhere in the jungle, Japanese commanders are writing reports that will struggle to explain how such a small force withstood 2 full-scale assaults. The cost is counted in the morning light. 23 American soldiers dead on that ridge. 41 wounded, some so badly they'll never return to combat. Of the 173 men who held the position through the night, fewer than 90 are still combat-capable by dawn, but they held. The Japanese left more than 90 bodies on the slopes and in the jungle approaches. Medical teams moving through the area in the following days will find blood trails suggesting at least another 100 wounded were carried away during the retreat. For General Hyakutak's forces, already weakened by months of isolation and starvation, these casualties represent a devastating blow to their remaining combat effectiveness. The Japanese never attempt another assault on that sector. Within a week, their forces pull back deeper into Bougainville's interior, ceding the territory they had hoped to reclaim. But the victory on the ridge doesn't bring the recognition it deserves. When the white captain finally arrives at the position at 0800, hours, more than 5 hours after the first attack, he surveys the carnage with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. His after-action report, filed 2 days later, is brief and bureaucratic. It mentions enemy probes successfully repelled and casualties within acceptable parameters. It doesn't mention the isolation, the failed communications, the desperate hand-to-hand fighting, or the fact that black soldiers held against odds that would have earned white units a Presidential Unit citation. Staff Sergeant Jefferson, whose leadership during the crisis saved dozens of lives, receives a passing mention. Sergeant Hayes, whose machine gun placement broke the first assault, is unnamed entirely. Private Reed, who fought 3 men with a bayonet and lived, gets no mention at all. This was the pattern throughout the Pacific War whenever black units distinguished themselves. White commanders, uncomfortable with evidence that contradicted their racial prejudices, either downplayed the achievements or attributed success to their own leadership from safe distances. Some reports went further. In instances where black combat units faltered, often due to inadequate support, poor equipment, or white officers who abandoned their posts, those failures were documented exhaustively and cited as proof that black soldiers couldn't fight. But victories like the Ridge were quietly filed away, mentioned in passing, if at all. The soldiers themselves knew better than to expect parades or medals. They had proven something to themselves and to each other. And for the moment, that had to be enough. The 93rd Infantry Division continued operations on Bougainville through the end of 1944 and into 1945. They patrolled, they fought skirmishes, they held defensive positions. By the time the war ended, the division had served in combat for 18 months across the Pacific Theater. Their service record was solid, their casualties proportional to other units facing similar operations. But in the official histories being written even as the war continued, their stories were footnotes. The narrative of the Pacific War became one of white Marines and Army divisions island-hopping toward Tokyo. The black soldiers who fought beside them, who bled the same and showed equal courage, faded into the margins of history. In the immediate aftermath, there were no medals ceremony for the men who held the ridge. No photographers arrived to capture their faces for newspapers back home. The Army's Stars and Stripes publication, which chronicled the war for American servicemen, never ran the story. But word spread anyway. Black soldiers had their own networks, their own ways of passing information that white command couldn't control. Letters home, conversations at supply depots, whispers in mess halls across the Pacific. The story of that ridge reached other black units. The 24th Infantry Regiment fighting in the Philippines, the 92nd Infantry Division preparing for combat in Italy, the thousands of black servicemen in labor and support roles who dreamed of their own chance to prove themselves in combat. The message was clear. When given the chance, when not sabotaged by inadequate support or racist commanders, black soldiers could fight. They could hold. They could win. This knowledge became ammunition in a different kind of warfare. The battle for integration and respect that would define the post-war years. When World War II ended in 1945, black veterans returned home, expecting that their service might have earned them some measure of equality. Instead, they found the same Jim Crow laws, the same segregation, the same violence. But something had changed within them. They had faced down the Japanese Empire. They had proven their courage under fire. They were no longer willing to accept second-class citizenship without a fight. The veterans of the 93rd Infantry Division and other black combat units became leaders in the emerging civil rights movement. They organized voter registration drives. They challenged segregation laws. They told their war stories to anyone who would listen, especially to young black Americans who needed to hear that courage and dignity were worth fighting for. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States military. It was a landmark moment, though implementation would take years. The order didn't come from presidential enlightenment alone. It came because black soldiers had performed under fire in ways that made segregation indefensible to anyone paying attention. But recognition for specific acts of valor came painfully slowly. It wasn't until the 1990s that the military began seriously reviewing whether racial bias had prevented black soldiers from receiving medals they earned. In 1997, President Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black World War II veterans, 6 posthumously. The list didn't include any names from Bougainville, but it acknowledged a larger truth. Discrimination had stolen honor from men who deserved it. Staff Sergeant Samuel Jefferson returned to Chicago after the war. He worked as a postal employee for 33 years and never spoke much about the Ridge. He died in 1987, never having received a medal higher than the Bronze Star for his actions that November night. Sergeant Robert Hayes went home to Detroit, married, raised 4 children, and attended every Veterans Day ceremony at his local VFW post. When he died in 2003, his obituary mentioned his World War II service in a single line: Private Thomas Reed, who fought 3 men with a bayonet and survived, lived until 2011. His family found his medals in a shoebox after his death. No Silver Star, no Distinguished Service Cross, just the standard service ribbons every soldier received for showing up. The ridge they defended never got a name. It appears on old military maps as Hill 260, notable only for its elevation. But for the men who held it, and for the black soldiers who heard their story, it became something more, proof that valor transcends every attempt to deny. Yet there's a particular kind of courage that defies easy understanding. The courage to fight for a nation that has not yet learned to fully embrace you, to put your life on the line for ideals that your country professes but doesn't always practice, to bleed for a flag that flies over, communities where you cannot drink from the same water, fountain or vote without facing violence. The men who held that ridge in November 1944 possessed this courage. They understood something that their enemies and even some of their own commanders could not grasp. That fighting for America meant fighting for what America could become, not just what it was. They were betting on the future, investing their blood in a promissory note they might never see redeemed. And, in a profound way, they were right to make that bet. The ridge itself was tactically minor, one defensive position among thousands across the Pacific theater. But symbolically, it represented something immense. Every round they fired, every Japanese assault they turned back, was an argument made in the language that war understands. Not speeches or petitions, but performance under pressure that could not be dismissed or explained away by racist ideology. The integration of the American military, the civil rights victories of the 1950s and 60s, the slow, painful progress toward equality, all of it was built on foundations that men like these laid down. They didn't fight alone, and their sacrifice wasn't the only factor in America's long reckoning with racism. But they were part of the proof that the old lies couldn't hold. History has a way of eventually correcting itself. Though justice delayed, is justice diminished. The men who held that ridge deserved immediate recognition. They deserved parades and medals and the gratitude of a nation. Most of them died without receiving it. But their story survives. It survives in the integrated military that exists today, in the black generals and admirals who command with authority their grandfathers were denied. It survives in every young person who learns that courage has no color, that valor transcends prejudice, that dignity is claimed not granted. On a nameless ridge in the Solomon Islands, in the darkest hours before dawn, a small group of black American soldiers held their ground against an empire. They fought two enemies that night, the one in front of them and the one within their own nation's heart. They defeated both. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to crack open a door that would never fully close again. That ridge is silent now, reclaimed by jungle, unmarked and unvisited. But what happened there echoes still.